Thank you. So here's some of the material we'll talk about. What is abortion? What does life? When does life begin? Hang on, I'm going to collapse my. There we go. How does faith-based healthcare in America manage the medical need for abortion, and how are American culture wars affecting us along the way? So let's just launch right into it, finding the way to advance my slides. So a pregnant person comes in, 19 weeks pregnant. Water has broken. She's having contractions dilated to 7 centimeters. She's panicked, in shock, desperate to hang on to her baby. And so she has waited at home, hoping for the best for about 12 hours. She's now running a fever. You are the physician caring for her, and you live in Texas. What do we think? How might we, as the physician, appropriately care for her? And I do want to just pause and take the quickest of maybe verbal and or chat thread comments. What does anyone think? And feel free, Lauren, to lead the way in that. I see someone.
Yeah, join in with the conversation. I don't have any children myself, so I have not been through that experience of having a pregnant wife. But I would think that this would be high anxiety for this family. Linda says she's going to die in Texas.
Yeah, I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat.
Gerald Lofthouse, Gerald is a physician, by the way.
All right.
He said antibiotics, but if too far in, allow delivery and pray. Anisha Kerr thinks she and the baby, their life is in danger.
Right.
Terry says, sad place to live if pregnant. Melody says she should receive treatment regardless of the outcome.
Yeah.
Janet says there's a probability of a bad outcome if she lives in Texas.
If she lives in Texas, yeah. Dr. Lofthouse said, allow her delivery. Sure enough, if she continues to actively miscarriage, but what if she was stabilized and the fever didn't stabilize? Would we then induct for delivery? Baby's too young to be viable. That's exactly right. 19 weeks. So in Texas, would we be allowed to induce for delivery? Or would we feel as though we can't do that? And my understanding of the law in Texas, and I am no lawyer, apologies for those who might be, but as I understand what's going on in Texas, this is already very difficult, and some physicians probably would not induce her to deliver the baby. I note Linda's comment. It's happening all across the country, Linda. Case number 2, pregnant person, 15 weeks, married with 3 children, needs immediate chemotherapy and later surgery to remove a cancerous growth on her uterus. But the treatment will prompt the loss of her fetus. If she does not get treatment, her doctors say she will run a 90% likelihood of death from the spread of the cancer. You are her pastor. She wants to know 2 things. What is God's will? And what does the church teach about how she should orient herself to this issue? There may be more than a couple pastors on the call. Let's pretend you're her pastor. How might you respond to her appropriately?
Well, that's a good question. Any of the pastors here, I would personally, I would want her to save her life rather than the uh, the fetus's life and get an abortion. Any
Hmm.
anyone, any of the others of you? Her life should take the priority. Mother's life first. Who cares what the church says? That's an interesting comment,
Uh-huh.
and I think it's a very telling comment.
Oh yeah, I've got a story to tell along those lines. Yeah.
Ray and Bobby said the pastor shouldn't be consulted.
Ah. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Have you ever been consulted on something like this, Lauren, when you were
I
pastoring?
have not. I have
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Nobody has ever called me, and usually, I don't know that the pastor is often consulted on ethical issues,
No, I don't think so.
hospital
Certainly not
anymore.
in Adventism. I'm unsure about other faith traditions. It
Now,
was
Tanisha,
interesting.
Tanisha actually has been through this situation. Sure,
Yeah,
we'll probably hear from her
yeah.
later. I know Tanisha's story. Her little ones had quite a time surviving, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly.
yeah. On one occasion, I was able to preach at Walla Walla's class reunion for the main sanctuary service. And a day or so afterwards, someone reached out to me by email, and we were able to talk about her experience 20 years ago when she and her husband faced a similar reality and lost their fetus. And I asked how, you know, her Adventist community had been able to be helpful to her, and she said, "We never once talked to anyone in our friends in our faith community about this, not once in 20 years." Um, and I find that just tragic. It just strikes me as so very wrong that a faith community can't openly embrace conversations along these lines. We'll say
I
more.
would say, Mark, that most of us weren't ever taught how to deal with
Yeah,
these sorts of things.
yeah,
We were never given we were taught how to read the New Testament in Greek, but not how to
right.
deal with people who have ethical conundrums in the
Mm.
operating room.
Yeah, and to that point, Lauren, I've not made much of it in the slides ahead, but um, to my understanding, and others online will know better than I, none of our North American colleges have a degree program, undergraduate degree program in ethics, explicitly in ethics. And I find that deeply problematic. Uh, Maybe someday we will. All right, next brief case. You're a brand new clinical ethicist at a Baptist hospital. A concerned Baptist pro-life local citizen calls the hospital asking if the hospital pharmacy provides or sells the morning after pill. You assure her that as a Baptist hospital, not in support of abortion, you do not. You hang up and then ask around because you don't know. You're a brand new ethicist. Well, it turns out that the emergency room provides a brand name Ella, which is ulipristal, for victims of sexual violence. Is that ethically acceptable? What does one think about that? And if so, let's say you think it is ethically acceptable. Would there be any boundaries around it? Would there be some margin of, okay, well, if the assault happened within 48 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours, would there be any sort of boundaries around that? Anyone want to chime in on that one?
Now, let me ask a question here of you.
Sure.
Is it ethical for anyone to ask those questions? Can you or the doctor ask those questions? Can you probe the parameters of what happened to this person
with the patient, you mean,
with the patient?
regarding the assault?
I'm talking with the patient regarding the assault. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's in the emergency room, and if I understand the emergency room context clearly enough, when someone comes in who has been assaulted, it's obvious they've been assaulted. It's not necessarily obvious that it was a sexual assault, but I think most ERs, in at least in metropolitan areas, have very extensive training about, number one, discerning whether or not it included sexual assault, and if so, they bring in a special team to help the person who, again, have extra levels of training. Now, that certainly is not going to be the case in a rural situation. And most of the time, particularly after having been in Alaska for 10 years, most of the time our ethics parameters, principles, ideas about what is or isn't ethically appropriate are what I'm learning to be called metrocentric or metronormativity with regard to how to proceed. And most rural contexts simply do not have the resources. So to your question, Lauren, it wouldn't be immediately obvious, and the person who would be interviewing the assault victim would be careful and responsible in terms of discerning that.
Yeah. I pastored in Appalachia
Yeah.
6 years,
Yeah.
and lots of little small city hospitals there.
Mm-hmm.
The stories I heard from people from these small city hospitals were rather surprising. It's not that people couldn't get common things treated well there, but there wasn't much sophistication. There wasn't much nuance, if anything went wrong at all. So the story you tell just kind of brings horror to me. People would say, "Yeah, I went there for my appendix, have my appendix up, but if anything happened, I'm not going there. They'll kill you."
No, I'm going to drive to the next county.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Drive to the big city mostly.
Thankfully, in those contexts, you do have the ability to drive to the next place. In Alaska, you don't. And it's far more remote rather than rural. And it makes me think also of Jim Walters. I think I saw him on the call on the people who've logged in. If I remember correctly, Jim used to pastor in West Virginia and very small communities as well. So some of the things we're talking about will have a little bit different response based upon location. All right.
By the way, I believe that's a different James Walters.
Oh, it is. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Two Jim Walters.
One last case. You work at a Lutheran hospital in the labor and delivery unit, the politically progressive. Everyone is aware of her politics. OBGYN physician you're working with is inducing delivery for a person whose 25-week-old fetus has abnormalities incompatible with life outside the uterus. The fetus will die, either while she carries it, delivers it, or soon after. You ask your charge nurse and your unit manager if ethics has approved this induction. They have. You are very pro-life and believe this is evil. Do you recuse yourself, invoking conscientious objection? Now, let me describe just a bit further on this. The cases that we've looked at prior include fetuses that are under viability. And viability has become a real norm in abortion ethics, in part because of the Roe v. Wade decision years ago, but also in part because of what medicine can do for a developing fetus prior to 24 weeks. Now, if my knowledge of the specific discipline is correct, nobody in the country, and then when I say nobody, I mean physician groups who deal explicitly with viability and young deliveries, nobody recommends trying to resuscitate a fetus under 24 weeks. They don't recommend it at 24 weeks, but at 25 weeks, they want to say this fetus deserves an effort in the neonatal intensive care unit. So there are some lines around ideas about what is or isn't appropriate for a fetus this young. Now, to the end of the description here, you're very pro-life and believe that this is evil. Do you recuse yourself, invoking conscientious objection? What do people think about that? Any thoughts, comments?
That's a harder one.
Yeah, in this case, the mother has found out that the fetus has abnormalities, genetic abnormalities, and it will not survive the abnormalities. We know that. Whether the fetus dies in utero and she carries it to delivery, whether it dies in delivery, there is no question in anyone's mind the fetus will die. It's a matter now of where it will die and how we can help facilitate care for the mother. Now, some people will take a very strong response and say nothing should ever be done in a case like this because God may still work a miracle, and we must give God as much time as possible. So they make a rule and say, no, when there is a fetal abnormality, you carry that baby, you carry that fetus as long as you possibly can, because God may work a miracle, and you want that miracle to happen. You pray, you start your prayer chains, and so on. So for this person at the Lutheran hospital, being pro-life and believing, taking a position like I've just described, and believing that induction should not happen, then they recuse themselves from the case. And it is common that a nurse can recuse him or herself through conscientious objection. It's more common for the physician tradition than it is for the nursing tradition, but recusal for conscientious objection at some point in our country there was effort to make a federal allowance for it. But typically it's built into hospital policy and managed by high-level nursing and physician managers at a facility level. For instance, to compare and contrast in other contexts, pharmacy students will often say, I will refuse to dispense an abortifacient in my career. So how do we protect a pharmacist's conscience? Typically, well, sometimes states develop laws that will allow a pharmacist to recuse themselves from dispensing an abortifacient, even if the state of the law in the state is to fulfill this prescription. They allow pharmacists to recuse themselves. However, they insist that the pharmacist tell the employer during the interview that they would invoke their conscience were they faced with this moral quandary from their perspective. So it's not uncommon that a person would recuse themselves in such a way.
One of the questions that's coming up here, Mark, in
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm watching is, does anybody care what the mother wants?
Right. Well, that's part of where we seem to be as a nation, in many cases and in many states now. And we'll get into that. I probably should stop jabberjawing and move forward, Dick, because we'll get into that. Anything else, Lauren?
Somebody said leaving it to God is leaving the choice to someone else, regardless of whom.
Uh,
God intervened sometimes, but he didn't intervene for those 6 million Jews in World War II.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
I've got another talk. Sometime maybe we'll come back and talk about the seeking of miracles in hospital context. Um, yeah, that makes for a very interesting conversation as well. All right, so Oxford English Dictionary is the authority for the English language. God bless Webster and whoever else has done it on the American side of the pond, but Oxford has it best. Abortion in their dictionary, the expulsion or removal from the womb of a developing embryo or fetus, especially in medicine, in the period before it is capable of independent survival, occurring as a result either of natural causes, fully spontaneous abortion, or of a deliberate act, more fully induced abortion, the early or premature termination of pregnancy with loss of the fetus. That's what an abortion is. This, I love, is a new feature of OED where they portray the use of the words that they're defining for us. And I find this fascinating. What happened, those of us who were around in the 60s and 70s, what on earth happened uh, in that time frame? You see this massive jump between 60 and 70. Does anyone have memory of what on earth happened at that time? Lauren, you've got a great memory. You were around then. What comes to your mind? Maybe you took a break. Anybody else
yes.
around at that
Sorry,
time?
I've got.
No worries.
I had to move to a different room here, so I'm.
Sure, sure. Anybody remember what happened in 1960? I didn't do an historical study on this. I just was enamored with the fact that they put this kind of data up for us. It's fascinating to me. My hunch is that there's something socio-political going on at that time and the culture wars. And the only thing in my memory that I recall was the creation of the moral majority. Does anyone remember the moral majority? They became a very prominent political influence organization somewhere in my memory it was the 70s, but I was just 10 years old in 1970, so it could be some other thing going back to 1960. Well, let's move along. um, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists have published this special guide designed to help inform language choice for those writing about reproductive health, to use language that is medically appropriate, clinically accurate, and without bias. Pregnancies are dated from the last menstrual period. Pregnancy is a gradual process that may vary for individual patients. Interuterine pregnancy begins when a fertilized egg implants itself in the uterus. Now, we might have spent some time on the question of when is someone pregnant? And that question, like so many others in this area, is debated. Some say pregnancy starts when the egg is fertilized. Some say pregnancy starts when the fertilized egg, implants itself in the uterus. So you can see that the ACOG group definitely positions themselves, though they give a nod to pregnancy as a gradual process. But when it implants in the uterine wall, and you'll see that this becomes relevant in Adventist positions on this question. So let me keep moving along. um, some of the terms that we hear. Is it adverbs? Is that what they are? Adjectives? I'm terrible with the English language, but the word right in front of the word we're talking about chemical abortion, surgical abortion, self-induced, elective, post-birth, abortion on demand, partial birth, direct abortion, indirect abortion. It goes on and on. These are only a few. According to ACOG, baby, unborn child, preborn child are not to be used for a fetus. Through 10 completed weeks after the last menstrual period, we should use the word embryo. And after that point, until delivery, fetus. And I do my level best always to use the appropriate words, in part because my mother told me when I was a child, Mark, think before you speak. I had a practice of speaking stuff that clearly was not thought out well. So she taught me that, among other things. So what words would we use? And you'll probably hear me use words that aren't consistent with this because we're just so used to it. But the American College of Obstetrician Gynecologists would like to help us. So when does life begin? This, of course, is an age-old question. Some would say putting a line on it anywhere is an absurdity. Well, entertain me or hold me up in prayer here for a little bit while I entertain this question. Moment of conception. This is a very, very common answer. Implantation in the uterine wall. First heartbeat. And these are answers that Christianity has proposed through the centuries. Quickening, the first movements of the fetus. Ensoulment. Now there's debate about when ensoulment happens in Christian history and where God sends the soul. My Muslim professor at UVA went to a conference in Iran at one point where they argued for a full week about where in the human person the soul resides. So it does become an interesting question. From a biblical perspective, one is hard-pressed to come to any other conclusion but that life begins at birth. And then finally, some would say graduation from medical school, that's when life begins. So you take a position wherever you think makes sense. But let's talk a little bit more about it. What exactly is the moment of conception, and when should we start protecting this conceptus? So is it when the head of the sperm hits the egg? Is it when the sperm gets into the egg and loses its tail? Is it when the two genetic pieces line up and make the first cell division? Is that the moment of conception? This chart is very helpful, so I hope you can see my cursor. If not, on the lower left side of my screen, you see the oocyte, the egg coming out of the ovary and down the tubes. The sperm comes up, meets the egg. First cell division is a zygote. Conceptus, do we call this a blastocyst? And what state is it? Well, here's a morula, here's a blastocyst. So I mean, it's not exactly exciting to tell your parents that, my gosh, I'm carrying a blastocyst. It just doesn't roll off with the mouth with so much joy to say, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have a baby. That's quite a different experience. One position that I personally don't take, but many do, and that is to say, regardless of what we're talking about here, whatever we call it, whatever we call it, it is certainly human, right? And the genetic determinism, that is, for some people, the answer to all this question revolves around the very core easily provable science of genetics. If this is a human thing, then it has the same value as any other human thing anywhere else in life. So say what you want, Mark, about what to call it. It's human, and that should resolve all questions about how it should be treated. See how that plays out. So moral status is something that's extraordinarily helpful for me to deal with narrowly difficult cases. And you'll note that the cases I shared above are narrowly difficult cases. And by that I mean, in most of those cases, both lives will not be savable. Someone is going to die. And how do we manage the lives in front of us, particularly in a hospital context, caring for the public, right? The church, I might take a position about this or that would help me orient myself to these questions. Now, when I open my doors to the public and serve the public with these things in mind, how does that change my sense of what I'm able to do for the public that I have signed on to care for, right? And I'm trying to linger with that because the context of offering healthcare to the American public places moral burdens on the entities offering these services. So moral status is something that ethicists have done through the years. Again, one of my colleagues, Jim Walters, published an article on moral status in the Encyclopedia of Bioethics, very useful source. You see these entities on the right. How would you value them in terms of moral status? Which of them has a higher moral status than the others of them? Does a rat have any moral status? Does the rat have a greater moral status than a rock? And we might ask ourselves, how does an entity get moral status? One of the ways to determine that is whether or not there is inherent status in and of itself. And if you take a creationist view of life, God created this thing, therefore it must have status. It may not have the same status as me, but it certainly has status simply because he created it. So does a rock have moral status in relation to a sequoia tree? So how would you rate these? And I've done so, and I've done this exercise many times through the years in my classrooms. And there's always about 1% of the people who refuse to categorize anything on moral status. They simply do not agree that this sort of determinative mental work should be done. And oftentimes downplay it as, oh, that's a philosophical question. I just love that response. That's a philosophical question, as if that's a useless thing to spend your time on. As an ethicist, you might imagine how I would react to that kind of statement. And I did put an eagle over a great ape. Many people would argue with me about that. To cell conceptus. Is a two cell conceptus more morally valuable than an eagle? A great ape? What do you think? A 1-month-old baby has more moral status than a 2-cell conceptus? How about a 50-year-old person? I first made this chart when I was 50 years old, so I thought I should at least put a 50-year-old person at the top of the pile of moral status. But I hope you get the point here that when in a situation where you can't save both people, the fetus and the adult, where and how do you draw lines? So here's some lines. You'll see on the left side, moral status, high at the top, low at the bottom, and a timeline on the bottom. Thus, the idea of moment of conception would be here and here. And death, although the line continues, but death would be at the end of the timeline. Now, there are two views about this, and the lines on the screen help establish those views. And they're called various things. Sometimes a genetic deterministic view would be the static view, and oftentimes personhood or personalism would be the variable view. But you get the point, right? The 2-cell conceptus, or earlier, if you wish, is as morally valuable as anywhere else on the line. And I frankly think that's a very powerful thing to assert. It doesn't help much when you're in a hospital trying to save two lives and you have to decide which of the two lives needs to be sadly lost. The variable view at least gives you some capacity to find an appropriate exception, if you will. And so these two positions have helped me at least find a way through. So, how does modern day healthcare, faith-based healthcare, deal with our need for handling such difficult cases? So, Seventh-day Adventists operate 95 hospitals across the U.S. We're not the only faith-based healthcare people. Catholics, obviously, but Baptists, Lutherans, Jewish communities, lots and lots of faith-based healthcare. To compare and contrast, which would be another good topic to actually dig into, there is no playing together on the part of our five Adventist corporations, except to say that they have joined the Adventist, or they have joined together in the Adventist Health Policy Association. And I suspect much kudos, or many kudos, ought to be offered to Jerry Winslow, who helped create this entity with support from a lot of people at Loma Linda and around in the various healthcare corporations. This group has a website. You'll see it there in the slides. It's easily enough found if you just Google Adventist Health Policy. But they make no statement about abortion. They have wanted to through the years, but it's a very politically fraught topic, and so they have shied away from it. The Catholic healthcare corporations are represented by Catholic Health Association in the United States, 674 hospitals, 1 of 7 of all U.S. patients is given a day, in any given day, get care at a Catholic hospital. They handle such questions through a document called the Ethical and Religious Directives, and they employ ethicists like me, hundreds of them across the U.S. healthcare corporation systems. And again, going to the point of Adventists being a bit behind, given the fact that there's no ethics undergraduate program and precious few ethics graduate level programs, how would our hospitals solicit and find persons with the capability to help them discern a difficult case like this? In the vast majority of cases, Adventist ethics questions are handled by chaplains who go to bedside and join others in the conversation and do their level best after some training with clinical ethics. All right, national standards are set by the Joint Commission, which says, sadly, 2 sentences about ethics, and that's it. In a group, in a document that has thousands of pages, the Joint Commission simply says a facility has to have a way to deal with ethical issues. The American Society for Bioethics and the Humanities, about a 25, 30-year-old society, combination of 2 of them, put together a book called Core Competencies in Clinical Ethics. It is the standard broadly for national context for bioethics and clinical ethics in hospitals. In the Catholic healthcare system, an established document referred to as Striving for Excellence in Ethics. It's now under editing for a 2nd edition. In 2010. And it should be noted that the Veterans Administration is really at the forefront, if you will, and is setting a best practice standard. It's been led by a woman named Eileen Fox for decades, and is a standout among the in the nation about how to deal with ethics. Moving right along, the ethical and religious directives. Let me give you just a brief introduction to, again, this is a document from Catholicism. This is managed, it's in its sixth edition, about 80 years. It was first started by the Catholic Healthcare Association of America, but handed off to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And so that group manages the various editions when it needs to be updated, this or that topic may be coming in line. It has six sections, and each section deals with certain particular concrete issues in healthcare. They have, that is, the bishops have promised to address issues in gender care in the next edition of this document. And they've at least initially proposed a very restrictive orientation toward Catholic hospitals along these lines. So in the ethical and religious directives then, oh dear, where am I? Oops. In the ethical and religious directives, it's very clear the position about abortion. Abortion, and we'll skip over the parentheses initially, is never permitted. No matter what modifier you put before the word, abortion is never permitted. Okay? But now they put a qualifier in front of abortion. That is, they define it here in this little parenthetical comment. Abortion, the directly intended termination of pregnancy before viability, or the directly intended destruction of a viable fetus, is never permitted. Okay, so what do they mean by directly intended? Well, in most ethics equations, one must have an intent to do the evil that would be the outcome of the action. If you don't have the intended evil outcome, there may be some mitigating factors that would allow you to move forward. It's called the doctrine of double effect. Thomas Aquinas is most famously attributed the full development of the doctrine of double effect. I haven't bothered you with it here, but if you're interested, it makes for very interesting reading. And it's been around since Thomas Aquinas for over almost 1,000 years. So this is a very well used set of principles for Catholic moral theological tradition and is applied in this document for issues at the beginning of life. Okay, so that's number 43. And you'll note in number 45, they give more detail. Operations, treatments, and medications that have as their direct purpose, right? Their direct purpose, the cure of a proportionately serious pathological condition of a pregnant woman are permitted. So just here, they said they're not permitted if it's directly intending the destruction of a viable fetus. Here they say some things are permitted when they cannot be safely postponed until the unborn child, note the language, unborn child is viable, even if they will result in the death of the unborn child. So there are a lot of myths out there about what Catholics will and won't do in their hospitals if they appropriately interpret the ethical and religious directives. Saving a woman's life, as we noted in a couple of the brief cases I started with, may be morally permissible. So that becomes part of the difficulty, is how we interpret what our churches teach. Now let's look at Adventism. So we've had statements about abortion since David Larson and a team at Loma Linda had a conference about it back in the 70s, maybe. I don't know if Dave is on the call or not. He's probably on his own Sabbath school class. But were it not for his work there at the Ethics Center at Loma Linda and many others involved in generating a statement, there was also a group who actually did generate a statement. Jerry Winslow was the primary author with the Committee for Human Life. Christian Committee for Human Life? I've now forgotten the title. There was a special committee that the General Conference Health Department convened to generate ethical statements about things like this. And they generated an abortion statement years ago. And I'll show you in just a second what that statement said. But in 2019, at the pushing of Elder Wilson, a new statement was generated. And I think it's worth repeating what they said there. They did at least repeat it there. The church, while not being the conscience of individual believers, has a duty to convey the principles and teachings of the Word of God. So here's what it says. As used in this statement, abortion is defined as any action aimed at the, again, intent, any action aimed at the termination of a pregnancy, and does not include the termination of a pregnancy known as miscarriage. So if it's an intention taken to terminate a pregnancy, then that's what they're talking about when they use abortion in this document. Thus, human life is of inestimable value. This is later in the document. This is true for all stages of human life, the unborn, children of various ages, and so on. Such an understanding of the sanctity of life gives inviolable and equal value. Remember what it said about moral status. Such an understanding of the sanctity of life gives inviolable and equal value to each and every human life and requires it to be treated with the utmost respect and care. God considers the unborn child as human life. So again, going back to those two lines, the straight line or the slightly arced line, Adventism doesn't say it quite as clearly, but they want to draw a line about when life begins. At conception, all stages, it says, of human life, and genetic determinism insists that if there's human genes in this thing, then it's human life. All right. Now, this is from an older statement about birth control issued in 1994. Because of uncertainty about how they will function in any given instance, they may be, that is, birth control, they may be morally suspect, note the language, for people, not us, for people who believe that protectable human life begins at fertilization. They might have said, we might have said, this is morally suspect because we believe protectable human life begins at fertilization. In 1994, we did not believe that. However, it says, since the majority of fertilized ova naturally fail to implant or are lost after implantation, even when birth control methods are not being used, hormonal methods of birth control and IUDs, which represent a similar problem, may be viewed as morally acceptable. And again, they define abortion, the intentional termination of an established pregnancy. What is an established pregnancy? It's one now embedded in the uterine wall. Is not morally acceptable for purposes of birth control. What else is said? Okay, so this is the statement from 1992. This was the original abortion document that no one in healthcare or in ethics wanted the General Conference to readdress in 2019. They did it anyway. Abortion, as understood in these guidelines, is defined as any action aimed at the termination of a pregnancy. Note what the 1992 statement said, already established. That was struck from the 2019 statement because they want to make the point of genetic determinism at conception, though they don't say life begins at conception. We don't say life begins at conception. That is clearly the movement of the 2019 statement. Distinguished from contraception, which is intended to prevent a pregnancy, not a conception. Focus of the document is on abortion. All right. Notable distinction. What can be made, what is to be made of the Protestant ethos in relation to the Catholic ethos in how our hospitals are run? Who officially owns the hospitals? Who has control over what is done in those hospitals? Remember, the hospitals are accredited by the public and operate under public licensure, not church licensure. In Catholicism, the archbishops, based upon a structure they call public juridical person, another thing very interesting to Google and find out a bit more about, may strip a hospital of its Catholic identity when they deem it necessary. As far as I know, Seventh-day Adventist clerics do not have such power. This slide is a very interesting recent book talking about Christian history of abortion, and I think it's interesting for us, given the use of the term abortion, the prevalence of American culture wars, and so on, to take a look back in our history and say, what has Christianity attended to along these lines in the past, and why is it such an issue now? So this book is a very good, I won't take much time because I want to move through the rest of these slides, but suffice to say that this author finds that Christian history does not support an extreme dogmatic stance as portrayed by the absolute pro-life rhetoric. And again, I don't need to introduce you all to the fact that there are two positions in American discourse about abortion. You're either pro-life or you're pro-choice. And that has not served the public well. The term culture wars, again, OED offers a use, and you note it almost mimics the exact time frame of abortion. Now, certainly that's not the only issue in American culture wars, but it certainly is indicative of the complexity of American society and how abortion is now so common all across the country in terms of issues that we're voting about and so on. Now, I'm not a lawyer or the son of a lawyer, but sometimes law is very helpful in ethics, and hopefully vice versa. Does in the form of questions, does the use of the word person in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution include fetal entities? And many states are arguing that it does, right? This is one of the reasons that some of the states in the South are in such legal conundrums, because they have established the idea in state law that a person defined as the tu cell conceptus has the same legal rights as that 50-year-old on that moral status ladder. And they argue that the Constitution to the United States indeed meant to include those kind of fetal entities. All right. Does the court system's defense of religious liberty in the form of conscientious objection extend to corporations? I find this a very interesting question. All of these faith-based healthcare corporations, if the government protects individual invocation of conscience, could it protect an entire hospital corporation chain? Say Adventists, right? And Adventists want to say no abortions in our hospitals. That's what I put on the slide, where there are 95 hospitals across the country that are Adventist. So in all of those communities, would the court protect us from saying to the public that we're licensed by the public to serve, that we will not do these things for you, like emergent abortion services, like some gender care issues, like some end-of-life care issues? So abortion is not the only issue at stake here under this notion of the U.S. court system of defense. Now, mind you, it's so strong, that is the U.S. court's defense of religious liberty in the form of corporate consciousness, that some lawyers are beginning to argue that it is actually a rupture of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, because the country is protecting the assertion of a particular religious code, belief, dogma in the service to the public. And it has become very, very difficult to navigate. I'm hopeful perhaps there's a better way to provide women's reproductive health protections in the U.S. in the wake of both Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision. This New York Times article portrays the fact that despite all of the efforts of the states that want to shut down abortion in any way, shape, or form, nationwide abortions rates have continued to rise. So the Dobbs decision and the bans across the lower states in particular were not effective in decreasing the overall prevalence of abortion in the United States. All right. couple anecdotal stories, and then we'll have time for discussion. I put cultural relativism here. The term I like best is, okay, Lauren, yes, what is it?
Oh, we're just getting ready for the discussion here.
Oh, I see. Okay,
People start raising their hands just as you finish
sure.
up.
So two anecdotal stories. One of the terms that I prefer using other than cultural relativism is perspectival relativism. And there was a theologian named Niebuhr who used the term perspectival relativism. And it's descriptive of what it is. And I would urge you to Google that as well. It's very interesting reading. And I think we have to come to some form of relativism, despite how people might think that's really bad. We have to come to some form of relativism in order to manage what the pluralistic societies all across the world that we have become. So I was preparing for some ethics education for Chinese ministers when I was at Loma Linda, and in part of the conversation to develop the curriculum for that, I was in conversation with a female pastor, as most in China are female pastors. And one of the things she told me was that I need not imagine that I should teach anything about the ethics of abortion to the Chinese minister, that this was not a moral issue there. She said 99% of us have had abortions, and it is not deemed an ethical issue. Now, it's striking to me that America could be so fraught about this issue, right? So concerned and voting and demonizing each other about this or that pro-life, pro-choice position, when faithful Seventh-day Adventists in another country don't even see it as a moral issue. I'm sure there are complex reasons why. I didn't dig into that with her. I do think there's some issues downstream of it, like sex selection, if you're going to selectively engage in abortion, or fetal reduction, if you will. But my point is to question, what are the culture wars doing to us in terms of our society at large, and even within our faith community? And then finally, the conversation I had to the comment that came earlier in the chat thread. I was talking to a physician, and I don't know that he was able to provide abortion, but we were talking about abortion. And he was asking me, he's a practicing physician, he was asking me as a clinical ethicist what my take was on abortion. And at one point in the conversation, I said to him simply, gosh, the church has a very good statement about abortion. He didn't respond. Our conversation kept going, and we chatted for a while longer. And he said, and by the way, Mark, he said, frankly, I don't care what the church says about abortion. And to me, that has always captured that Protestant ethos, right? That is, yeah, the church may have something to say about it, but I am the one making this decision. And I get that. I'm deeply Protestant myself, but I think it has some weaknesses. And that is, among other things, a faith community that doesn't know what their church teaches and doesn't care. And so as a cleric myself, I want to say it is important that the church has a very clear teaching about this. It doesn't mean as a Protestant that I have to toe the line into exactly what the church says, but we jolly well ought to be clear about it. And I think that's one of the weaknesses. I think also, putting it stated differently, it's good to have a clear position from the church in order to live out one's life in what many would deem as a morally appropriate perspective. So the only thing I have left is a slide that shows discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and finally be able to see everybody again. All righty. Do we take a break or we just march right through, Lauren?
Yeah, Dan takes over at this point.
Okay.
We march right through.
Good.
What a topic. raises so many questions. I have a couple things myself, which I'll kind of add now or later, but it's such a contentious issue, at least in this country. I think for purposes of our discussion, I would like to hear from all sides, and I would like us to be respectful of everybody's opinion so we can get an idea what people are thinking. You don't have to disagree. You don't have to argue about it. State your reasons and your point of view, because we want to know what the point of view is. And there's so much to talk about, ethically and otherwise. Personally, Gina and I had two healthy children, and then there was a third pregnancy that was spontaneously terminated very, very early in the pregnancy. At that point, I think we decided we didn't want to have more children. I actually obtained a vasectomy, so put that out there. But is it morally okay to continue having sexual relations when there's no baby to be born? Well, I haven't lost a lot of sleep over that, but I think I'm comfortable with that decision. I think on the basis of those who are adamantly pro-life, I never quite understood the reason they would accept exceptions for rape and incest. That doesn't seem consistent with protecting the fetus who has no ability to protect itself. I know you don't want, it's not a good thing to have a baby born from rape or incest, but is that the baby's fault? No. And the other thing that strikes me is that the argument has become so contentious in our country. I can't believe that all the pro-life people are only concerned with that issue of a baby being born. It becomes a political issue and divided between two different worldviews. And most of those who are anti-abortion don't really have a dog in the fight. They've never been pregnant. They've never offered to adopt an unwanted child. I sometimes question their commitment to the cause. Anyway, I'm hoping that those who've had experience in this will feel free, if they're able, to offer an opinion, who've had an abortion or chosen not to, those who have an opinion on it or personal experience. And again, urge everybody to be accepting of the views that are being offered. So our friend Linda is up. Linda, I think you're unmuted. Why don't you go ahead and join the conversation?
I am. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. And thank you, Dr. Carr, for your presentation. It was of great interest, I'm sure, to everyone here and certainly to me. I'm not a physician, nor have I had any situation where it was necessary for me to have an abortion, so I cannot speak from personal experience. But the thing I wanted to ask you about, Dr. Carr, is the fact that there is this very odd passage in Numbers 5 that talks about what appears to be a spontaneous abortion, where the wife is suspected of infidelity by the husband and is sort of drug into the presence of a priest who forces her to drink water with dirt from the floor in it. And if she aborts there, then it's believed that she was in fact unfaithful to her husband. You're nodding your head, so you're familiar with that text. Sure. I have one more question, but let me ask you that. What is your take on that? What does that say to us?
Yeah. Well, that launches into another, a very appropriate topic, is how we take scriptural passages with regard to modern iterations of this. It makes me also think of how which couple was it that put they made the goats drink water in front of sticks that had bark peeled off them or something?
It was Jacob.
So
it was Jacob who did that to increase his own herd. Yeah.
Yeah, and so God bless those who are biblical exegetes. I decided long ago I would not become a biblical exegete because it's fraught turf in our tradition. But suffice to say that we have not done well with passages like that if we think they have direct relevance to the more scientific conversations that we have these days. So how do we read scripture as metaphorical, as story? Narrative ethics and narrative biblical interpretation is, in my view, a profoundly important way to look at scripture. We've done almost nothing in our church about understanding scripture from a narrative perspective. Thanks, Linda.
Well, and just my second question, if I may,
Sure.
which will be brief. When you had your chart up with the two lines, that with a straight line was where how people vary in their belief about the moral nature, whatever, of a human being or human life. While the numbers story may be specious, I'll grant you that. But in Levitical law, it's very clear that the life of a child was not worth as much as the life of an adult.
Absolutely. Right.
And so we have to, and that's Levitical law. So we have to at least acknowledge that is there, that the law did not give the same value to an unborn fetus as it did to
No, it didn't. Clearly not. Yeah. In fact, there's a lot of talk recently because of Reinder's book, what we can learn from Catholics. Well, we can learn a great deal from Jewish people. One of the courses in my PhD program, which, by the way, was in religious ethics. So I had to take comprehensive exams in Judaism, in Islam, and in Christian ethics. And there was a course on the question of when life begins in these three Abrahamic faith traditions. And there was no question from our Jewish professor. Life does not begin until birth.
Well, and in fact, let me just ask you this, because is it not true that the shift in that towards life begins at conception actually occurred back in the 1960s, and it was with a religious theological push? It did not come from scientific parts.
That's correct in my understanding of history, that while there has always been concern for when life begins and so on, and when it's protectable or not, and so on, it clearly has historical background that we ought to pay more attention to. One of the slides I deleted just before coming online was a reference to Maimonides, who is a Jewish physician and philosopher in the area of Egypt, I think, back in the before 1000, if my memory is correct. And one of the things he said about abortion in a Jewish tradition was that when the fetus and the pregnant person are having a difficulty, one may lose the fetus because it's deemed as a pursuer. And there's a specific word used in the Jewish tradition, which allows one to thwart the pursuer with proportional means to save and rescue the one who is being pursued, and whatever the context. And Maimonides applied it to abortion.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Thank you, Linda. Andreas, your turn.
Yes, thank you. A couple of remarks in advance. Being pro-life and being pro-gun is something that really beats me. As well, very American, let me put it this way. I'm calling from Germany. Number two, I think it's more than an ethical issue at times. When my mom was pregnant with me, all doctors recommended an abortion for medical reasons, so that she would survive. Maybe I wouldn't be viable anyway. She decided against it and had a difficult time finding a doctor to support her. I'm quite glad for her decision, actually.
Yes.
So it's a bit more complicated. But the question I have is, maybe you have raised it earlier. I didn't know you still were on daylight savings time or whatever, so I was a bit late. Social ethics versus individual ethics. It seems that the whole topic of abortion has moved to individual ethics, while in earlier times it may have been much more of a social ethical issue. And indeed, looking at rich countries like Germany or the US, I think there is a social issue as well. Perhaps you would like to make a couple of comments, please. Thank you.
Oh, certainly. Thank you, Andreas, for your comments. Yes, in fact, as a Protestant entity, Adventism is not particularly good at focusing on the social. And if you've followed, excuse me, if you've followed some of the commentary of Elder Wilson with regard to social justice issues, it's clear that he doesn't understand the social context for which those who are, impassioned along those lines are seeking what Catholicism calls the common good. And again, if you'd like to Google some very interesting material, Google Catholic social teachings. And there are a collection of again, principles that have developed that seek focus on the common good. And for the specific context of American healthcare, part of what I hope you heard me say is that while we are connected to our tradition, and we want to be connected to our tradition, the tradition that is the clerics of the tradition, true in Adventism, true in Catholicism, Lutheranism, Judaism, doesn't matter. The clerics want to maintain, and their role is to keep the tradition honest to itself. All right. The public ministry, or to use your verbiage, Andres, the social work of the church, and in America, in the specific context of a faith-based healthcare ministry, is a messy enterprise in relation to those clerics. They like things clear. The public is messy. Now, again, in the American context, we are licensed not by the church, but by the public. And so it creates a necessary tension between the public ministry of healthcare in our communities and our faith tradition. And I see that in every faith tradition that I've looked deeper into in terms of caring in the form of a hospital or healthcare ministry. Now, that's apart from the culture war stuff and all of the influence of that. But I think it's very relevant in terms that you've pointed out. How do we imagine the common good? And during the pandemic was another great illustration of that, right? Adventists, many of them were arguing, no, forget about it. You're not putting that stuff in me. I don't care what the common good is. I don't care what public health is saying. My individual body is sacrosanct, and I am not putting that stuff, regardless of what I might do to my neighbor, if I get the vaccine or the virus. So it's a fraught area, Andreas. I agree completely. Thank you for that question.
Our friends Ray and Bobby.
Hi, Ray and Bobby.
Hi. I enjoyed your talk. The question that always comes to mind, and I've had it over the years, ever since this abortion issue became a big issue across mostly this country. How do people spend so much time on defining what should happen when we have almost a total lack of any discussions about once that child's born? What happens then?
Yeah.
It's an unwed mother, or it's a woman who was raped. For all of those who are anti-abortion under any, what happens then? Do we have discussions in our churches or any of these other churches, organizations, on how do we treat that woman?
Yeah.
How do we treat them health-wise afterwards? What about the trauma? I mean, we are so totally focused on the abortion issue that there's not discussion on life after. And in fact, in the current political environment, as you mentioned, social, you're considered woke if you want to get into all those other issues.
Sure.
Big anti-abortion, but
And
social care, no.
and woke in the most negative terms, not positive.
So
Right.
how do you approach this subject? Why don't we have more talk within our church about taking care of all of those if we're anti,
Yeah.
or any organization or society?
It takes a lot of speaking from this side of the pulpit, if you will, whether it be a professor's lectern or a preacher's pulpit. It takes a good deal of courage, Ray, particularly for our young ministers who have a lot vested in keeping their jobs. And the congregation or the classroom is more politicized now than it's ever been. When one speaks, one must know as a minister, someone is going to come after you. And so part of the difficulty is trying to find a way to present and have the conversation in sufficiently gentle ways so that one doesn't get in trouble. I committed to myself years ago when I started teaching not to talk about abortion in class. I never, after my PhD program, I never wanted to talk about it in class. It was unavoidable. I could not talk about it. But when and how do we have the courage? And like you say, what happens afterwards? On one occasion, a woman called me when I was at it was a minister called me when I was at the Center for Bioethics at Loma Linda. A younger minister, he said, we're having a business meeting tonight because our teen Sabbath school teacher is pregnant. And I said, oh, okay, well, she's pregnant. So to your point, Ray, it's not just about abortion or what happens afterwards. We're concerned about what happened ahead of time. What about those people having sex out there, right? And the pastor went on to say that, well, she decided at this point in her life that she was not likely to get married, but she really wanted a child. So she went to a clinic and became pregnant and had a child. And members of the church want us to disfellowship her. Should we do that?
Goodness.
I was astounded. I was shocked. How could that be an appropriate way to help this person now manage her life? It was, I don't know what happened to me at that point, but it was not a happy story.
Well, to me, in the whole issue of care before and care after, and I'm probably wrong, but this is the way I view it, we're basically talking about a hang-up down through whatever period of time over sex, period. We're more concerned about what happens than life itself.
One of my colleagues and friends refers to it as pelvic morality. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Ray and Bobby. It occurs to me, I don't know if you agree, Mark, that these big issues of abortion and euthanasia and some of these significant life issues have already been pushed forward in some of the developed countries, still quite contentious here in the US. Is this a social evolution that will continue in that direction? I kind of have a feeling we're going through the death throes of those holding on to these practices that may disappear this century.
Yeah, I think some of it will change. I've often had hope that my children will adjust what I have felt passionate about in ways that are more compassionate. I want people to be passionate about what they believe in. I think boy, if we can't have conversations with each other where people can voice their passion, then our conversations are just useless. I mean, what's the point of talking about the weather all day long unless we're passionate about it? So I like those kind of conversations. But again, culture wars don't allow us to have nuanced conversation. And that's just ugly reality.
I like that. Well put. George.
And I would also say in healthcare in particular, it's very important us to follow what I like to refer to as the preponderance of evidence, right? There's this phrase called evidence-based medicine, and many people associated with healthcare will know exactly what I mean. And that is, we're supposed to allow the evidence to lead the way, not the socio-political dynamic that we're in, but the evidence of the particular medical specialty, and that is not often hard and fixed. It ebbs and flows with evidence. That's the nature of scientific investigation and evidence that comes from it. But it's difficult for us to shift and adjust based upon that.
Agreed. George, go right ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Carr, for discussing this issue that's so important at this time, especially this week. What always strikes me hard is the fact that the pro-life people usually disclose only half of what they are, because they are usually, in most cases, I haven't seen one exception to this yet. Maybe there's someone in the audience. Every single pro-life person that I have met so far is also a pro-death person. So
a what person? Sorry?
Pro-death.
Oh, pro-euthanasia, I see.
Pro-life,
assisted death.
Euthanasia. Pro-life, they want to protect the fetus or that. And they have no problem with the mothers dying when medical services are not provided. I haven't seen one person say, oh, you know what happened because of this, that person died. We see it on TV these days so often, cases after cases, and not one single pro-life stood up to say, well, this is wrong. No, they have no problem. They are pro-that.
Right.
And this is outrageous, you see? This is hypocrisy. This is terrible. I myself look back when one day we lived in Riverside for 33 years, and one day we got a call from our daughter from Salt Lake City, where my son-in-law was finishing his training in medical school, graduate from Loma Linda, but was in Salt Lake, and she told us that her pregnancy of 6 weeks had terminated because the fetus had died. There was no heartbeat.
Yeah.
So we immediately gave her all support going there and all that stuff. And I'm thinking, wow, nowadays we could have lost her, lost our daughter because of that.
Yeah.
How can that be? So there's a loss of human sensitivity also that comes along with all this. There are so many people who just don't care. They lost human sensitivity. That it's amazing how people lost it.
Yeah,
Christians, non-Christians, everyone is just their heart is hard.
Two things come to mind, George. One is that some people, there's this one person in moral theological tradition who's famous for having said, better 2 deaths than 1 murder. So when one conceives of any kind of abortion as a murder, even when one is saving the mother's life, then it would be better to allow both to die than to engage in an abortion which is deemed murder. Now, that's a very extreme view, and I put a slide to this point, but pulled it off later. And that is, I've been involved in publishing a book called World Religions for Healthcare Professionals for over 20 years, and it surveys probably a dozen different world religions, something like that. And no one in those years of editing this book has ever argued that a religion officially, formally encourages its women to sacrifice themselves for the fetus. The other thing that comes to mind very quickly is that studies have shown that the human mind is capable of holding what are, on the face of it, entirely conflicting views. And one, I think, sees this in present American culture wars, particularly as it regards to political figures and the things that come into use of weapons, as Andreas pointed out earlier. We humans are able to hold two very conflicting views internally and somehow not be bothered by it. So the things that may bother me wouldn't bother someone else for reasons that I don't understand. And I think we can learn a lot from psychiatry, psychology about how it is that we can hold what appear to be disparate views and yet happily sleep at night.
Well, certainly, I'm a psychologist, retired now. Certainly, the wiring in the brain is responsible for many of these absurdities.
Yeah.
It's wired in the brain. It's and this is why I think it's so important this week to remind everyone: please vote. Please vote for our society. You see, it's a social issue that we are dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, George. Yeah.
I see in the chat, Linda Nottingham jumped to the same issue that I noticed, inconsistency in those who are pro-life, but also support the death penalty. And that's a whole other discussion, but it's just one of the issues that's raised. So let's see.
What happened to
Letitia?
Tanisha, I'm here.
Oh, there she is. Tanisha.
There you go.
Sorry, Tanisha. You popped down on my screen. Go right ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I don't really have a question, but I thought I would share a little bit about my experience, because this is a topic that really, really angers me, because there are so many people who have an opinion who don't really know what they're talking about. One of the things is when it comes to choosing between the life of the mother and the life of the child. And that, I hate the fact that that decision could be legislated. Because just from the discussion with our small group, we don't even have a consensus, and we're of the same faith community, and we can't even come to a consensus on if there's a crisis, whose life should be saved. I know for me, I had 3 miscarriages, 2 of which required an abortion. And I'm sorry. The third one, I almost died. And when my doctor told me if I really wanted to have children, I had 3 months to get pregnant, because I had to try to carry a baby to term within a year, or I wouldn't have been able to. And so my husband and I made the decision that we were going to try again. And we were blessed. I became pregnant. And then I found out that we were having twins. And I was already high risk. And I remember when they found the second heartbeat, they literally told us, don't move. And they went to go get the doctor, because now a high risk pregnancy was now significantly more complicated. When we got through the first trimester, the doctor told me the magic number is 24 weeks. We got to get you to 24 weeks. And so I had a whole list of things that I could not do because the goal was get you to 24 weeks, which is the age of viability. At 20 weeks, I went into labor. At 20 weeks, I was in full-blown labor. And at that point, the discussion was going to be to take my babies to save my life. And all I could think about was, do whatever you need to do to me, but save my babies. Whatever you have to do, save my babies. And I thank God that 10 years ago, this was not a political discussion. Because I cannot imagine being in the hospital, scared for my life, scared for the life of my babies, and having a doctor who is scared for his license and scared about his freedom. And that is what is going to determine the care that I would get and that my babies would get. Because he's afraid that if he tries to help me, he's going to go to prison.
Right.
How is it this makes sense? How does this make sense? That
No, it doesn't.
So when I hear political candidates talk, it angers me. It angers me. There's this term that gets thrown around about late-term abortions for the purpose of contraception. 1% of abortions for the sake of contraception occurs past 21 weeks. Nobody gets to the age of viability and then goes, oh, well, this was fun, but never mind. And then you have a candidate who will stand on stage and say, oh, well, we'll have the baby and then decide what we're going to do with the baby. When my children were born at 26 weeks and 26 weeks and 2 days. At 24 weeks, they started to prepare me for the babies to be delivered because they didn't think I was going to make it. And I told, whatever you need to do to me, put me in a coma. I don't care. Whatever you need to do to me, just save my babies. And when my babies were born, thankfully, God put me in a community where they had an advanced enough NICU that could save a 1.5 pound baby, because I had 2.5 pound babies at 26 weeks.
And those locations are not very common.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
And so when they were born, they told me that they had an 8% chance of survival.
It's a tough way.
And I was able to see both my babies come home. And I wrote a book about it. And I had the opportunity to travel and share my story and encourage other couples. And I remember being at one church where a couple came up to me. Their baby was born at 28 weeks. And they didn't have the facilities to take care of them. And literally, the baby was born and was just left because they they couldn't do anything. And then somebody's going to stand on stage and politicize that to say that a family is going to have baby and then decide whether or not they want to keep. It sickens me that we have made this a political issue when none of us have the right to tell a family what to do. None of us has the right to tell a doctor that he cannot or she cannot do their utmost best to take care of their patients. It is not our place. It is not our right. God gave us choice. We have the choice to sin or to not sin, to live a sinful life, or to try our best to be Christ-like. And yet we try to legislate morality in the name of Christ, who gave us the freedom to choose. It is unjust, and it is completely unethical.
Those American culture wars.
I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Thank you for sharing.
To share because I really get frustrated with people
Yeah. And
who don't really understand the
your
issue.
last name as Carr or Kerr?
My mother-in-law says Carr.
I like Carr.
Yes.
Well,
But thank you
so
for the
much,
care and
Denise.
sensitivity with which you presented this topic.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciated it.
Yeah.
And for those who are not aware, November is National Preemie Month. So
Right
yes,
on.
so very
Well, and that's
appropriate
another
timing.
topic for us sometime as well, Tanisha, and that is the lives of babies and families who have survived the NICU. This is no small task.
Yes. No, it's not. It's
Yeah.
not. Yeah, for us it was 4 surgical procedures,
Yeah.
3 months in
Yeah.
ICU, 2
Yeah.
years sleeping on the ground. No, 2
Oh,
years
my
in
God.
quarantine and 1 year of me sleeping on the ground between their cribs because I'd have to get up and give them infant CPR in the night. It was a journey,
Tough
but
road.
thank God they are doing so well now.
Excellent.
And I am just so grateful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanisha. I sense from the comments and the video I see of faces that everyone appreciates your story and wishes you and your family well. Now, Carl Lawrence was previously looking to, I don't know if he's still on board. Carl, I'll give you one chance here to unmute if you still want to make a comment. There he comes. Thank you, Carl. Where are you calling from, Carl?
I'm calling from Silver Spring, Maryland.
Go ahead.
I have to admit I lowered my hand after hearing Tanisha's story because my comments were I don't know. I that's a hard act to follow. I felt, and my comments paled in gravity to Tanisha's story. I wanted to thank you for the presentation and to comment on a comment you made early in the presentation about ethics education.
Yes.
Specifically. And I wanted to second that, but also to suggest that ethics education needed to be more broadly available to the laity in the church, not just to those who were perhaps privileged to attend an Adventist school. Because I mean, I have a graduate degree, but I never I've never attended an Adventist school.
Right.
And I sort of wondered though, about should we be looking to the church, or should we look elsewhere for education, religious or biblical education more broadly, and ethics education more specifically? I mean, where does the Adventist layperson look for that kind of an education? Because in my estimation, the church does not do particularly, or has not for me done a particularly good job in either case, religious education or ethics education. So anyway, that was my comment. But I want to extend my empathy to Tanisha for her story, and for her for being bravely sharing with us.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. A couple things come to mind. No, we have not done well in terms of educating ourselves about ethics. I could go on for quite some time about it. The essence of it, an internal debate about whether ethics is even necessary. There was this group called the Biblical Research Institute. Lauren, you may remember the person at the head of that group years ago who's deceased now. He always wore a flat top. His hair was a flat top. Do you remember this fellow?
What's his name?
Oh, I forget his name. I don't know. But his point was, and he was at the head of the Christian View of Human Life Committee, ethics is not a discipline. There is no such thing as an academic discipline of ethics, because when one comes to Christ, there are no more ethical issues to deal with.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a very common thought, Carl, which I think is abysmal, but it's not an uncommon thought, even among professors at our universities. So
like this.
yeah. Now, that doesn't recuse us or excuse us for being so narrow-minded, but it does go back to the broad dispute among Adventists clear back to the beginning of our history about whether or not a liberal arts education is for us, or whether simply dogmatic instruction from Scripture is sufficient. And we chose the liberal arts path. That's the official choice, including Ellen White's support of it. But there are many amongst us who would prefer it to be the other way. And many of them have a lot of authority within the church. So honestly, I'm not altogether sure we can be hopeful about whether or not ethics education will become part of our standard offerings.
Man, Carl, your comments were completely appropriate. We needed to take a breath after Tanisha's extraordinary story. I see Ray and Bobby. Bobby's in place, and they came back on. Normally, I jump ahead to the other hands, but I wondered if you had something you really needed to say. Go ahead.
I think Bobby, we missed Bobby, didn't we?
Well, we saw her. We saw Ray talking.
No, I know, but I think Bobby had some things to say too.
She may. You'll need to unmute.
Uh-oh, yeah. There we
go.
Oh, muted again.
Try again, Bobby, unmute.
Am I here?
Go ahead.
There you go.
Wow, Tanisha. Your story just brought me to tears. Abortion is such a complex issue that it cannot be held within a soundbite.
No.
I am a retired nurse, and I know from history and stories that have been told from long ago that there has always been abortion. Women have always had abortions for whatever reason. And my heart just bleeds for those women who were not able to or did not want to, in the strongest sense of the word, carry a pregnancy to term, who have had back alley abortions and have ended up bleeding to death or dying of infections or whatever. Or even if they did survive, they were never able to conceive again because of that procedure. So my take on it is that even though I am not pro-abortion as such, I would prefer that there is a safe, sterile procedure available for women who find themselves in that situation. And for hospitals to deny care to women who are carrying a dead fetus or whatever complications there are that require termination of that pregnancy, they are not a full service hospital. And I greatly resent politics getting into that, and the destruction of Roe versus Wade, I think, is a huge sin upon our country. And I don't know, I just feel very strongly about it. And the decision whether to carry a pregnancy on or whatever, that needs to be thoroughly discussed between the patient and the doctor. The woman is the patient, and the doctor is the one providing professional counsel and care. And that should not be jeopardized. My goodness. Tanisha is so right. If she were in that situation today, she would have died.
Yeah.
And there are young women who have died because they have been denied the care that they needed. And that is just so wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's good that the church does have a statement, but that it needs to be not so dogmatic and not so narrow, that it's a huge, it's a huge complex situation that can't be just in one sentence.
It demands nuance, doesn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing, Bobby, to your point, and we've all noted it, Tanisha, and we appreciate Tanisha's willingness to be emotional with us. Oftentimes in presentations like this, it's rather technical, like it's rather cerebral. But the fact is, it's an emotionally fraught, difficult conversation. And oftentimes in ethics, we think that emotion should be out of ethics, that there should not be an emotional influence in a moral deliberation, if you will. But I would beg to differ. In fact, you saw me lean over. This is my dissertation from my PhD. You probably can't see what it says, but it's 200 and some pages about emotion and the virtue temperance in moral deliberation. I would not suggest that you buy the book. It is available, but it costs like $150 because only 5 sold through the last 25, 30 years. So, but how do we make that point in conversations that are difficult, that in fact, emotion is essential to the conversation? It's
Absolutely.
not a cerebral conversation. Thanks for that, Bobby.
You're welcome. And thank you.
Pleasure.
Very good.
If
I'm
I
asking.
see, go ahead, Dan. But I see a friend Elisa Elissa is on the call. This is wonderful. She and I
Exactly.
work together at Loma Linda.
Go right ahead.
Hi, thank you. Nice to hear you again, Dr. Carr.
Likewise.
I wanted to just share. I am a CFO of a hospital in Maine, in the U.S. Currently, but in the past have worked for Adventist health facilities around the country. And for a while, I was CFO of St. Helena Hospital in Northern California.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that we did there, we were working towards a memorandum of understanding and agreement to work with several of the Adventist hospitals in Northern California in partnership with a Catholic system in that area. And it went through all the self-study evaluation, went to the Attorney General of California, and it ended up getting denied. And the main reason that it was turned down is because of the Adventist statement on abortion. And they felt, the Attorney General, who is the same guy that's still there, was very clear that he did not want it to there to be a limit on the community having access to abortion.
Mm-hmm.
But the interesting thing is that we had all kinds of conversations, even from our corporate legal team and executives, trying to explain the nuance of the Adventist statement on abortion. The interesting thing is, and I saw Ed Reif Snyder and some others from Advent Health, where I also worked for 7 years of my time with that system. No one really talks about abortion in the Adventist hospitals. So it's like it happened maybe, but it's not really focused on or talked about, which, obviously for privacy reasons, but even as a service that we offer to the community. So we were trying to, in this agreement, hopefully to partner with the Adventist and the Catholic system in Northern California. We were trying to be nuanced to say, we actually do provide women's health care that's needed, and tried to advocate for the Adventist health hospitals that would provide the care that's needed. But because of the nuanced ways that the statements were and their assumptions really of a Protestant or a conservative church, they assumed that we didn't. And so the partnership didn't go through. So I just thought it was an interesting dynamic. And I don't think the hospital leadership could really come out and say, you know, clearly that we don't necessarily promote abortion, but they were kind of stuck in a place that made it difficult. But it seemed like more of a misunderstanding on the part of the Attorney General, that they didn't clearly understand the Adventist perspective. So they just denied the whole agreement. So just an interesting perspective. I'm no longer working in Adventist hospital setting, but as a side note, in a non-religious based community hospital, abortion also is never really talked about. It's just not really a issue. Care is provided that's needed, but it's not really debated, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that even in a context that of a facility, a healthcare facility, caring for the public without a religious background, the culture wars have become so prevalent that we find we can't even have a conversation about it in non-faith-based contexts, which is striking to me. But thanks for sharing that, Alyssa. I did write an article some years ago, published in a Catholic journal, regarding some of the cooperative agreements that joint ventures, whatever business world calls them, between faith traditions. And it's not limited to Adventism and Catholics, Lutheran systems. There are lots of partnerships among faith-based caregivers across the country.
Right, very good. On the line is Sherry Craig. Go right ahead, Sherry.
Thank you. I have two different things that I want to say. Tanisha, your story is so moving. I had a friend probably 35 years ago who found out she had cancer within a few months of being pregnant. And she chose not to be treated until the baby came. And unfortunately, she died when the baby was 2 or 3 because she had put off her treatment. But it was her choice. She could do what she wanted. The other issue I want to talk about, and I just need to preface this, that I am not a historian. I'm not a political historian. But if you do look back in the history of abortion as a right-wing issue, it was not a right-wing issue, say 50 years ago. But certain people there were looking for issues to coalesce, to get people to join their side, and they chose to make it an issue. And that's really the history of how it came to be such an overwhelming situation today. Like I said, I'm not a historian, but I have read that much history about abortion. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And you remind me of another thing. Your story of your friend who died. It's one thing individually, right, and a person's conviction about what they're willing to undergo in terms of their own health and safety, and that of their fetus come baby. It's another thing altogether when an entire religious institution says to its women, "You should sacrifice yourself," right? And I oftentimes, again, the moral context gets lost. That's a very different moral question. individually faced, as opposed to a whole denomination or religion saying to its women, this is what you should do. And sometimes that's lost in our conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. She could have had an abortion. It was her choice.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. You're muted, Dan. You're muted.
While Dan figures that
Thank
out,
you.
go ahead and slip in here.
Let Lauren go ahead.
I just want to remind everybody that next week, Ryder Brinsma is going to reprise his talk at Riverside, the one probably most of you read about, that he was going to announce his new book on Adventist and Roman Catholicism, the story of a very difficult relationship, at least on our side. I don't think it was all that difficult on the Roman Catholic side, but it certainly was from our point of view. And he was going to do a talk on that in Riverside, California, and he was prohibited from doing it on an Adventist campus, which actually brought a whole lot more people in to hear it. Well, he's going to talk about that next week among us. So I'm looking forward to that. Reinder is one of our very favorite teachers. He's always very, very careful and very articulate, and we enjoy having him. So he'll be here next week.
Excellent.
So I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that. If you have anyone that you want to tell about this, please let them know.
And Lauren, let me just wedge in. I think I'll attend because shameless self-promotion and part of Spectrum promotion, I'll be writing a book review of his book.
Oh, good.
For Spectrum. So that'll be fun.
Good. Well, I just wanted to make a comment here. I think all of us were very touched by Tanisha's story. You should know, everybody, if she hasn't already written this in the comment, Tanisha's children are doing wonderfully. Their aunt, Cherry Ann, who's got her hand up, said they're almost as tall as her now. And so it was a really happy ending to that story. But I was very touched, Mark, by Tanisha saying, I don't want a doctor to have to calculate whether he's going to lose his license or not, rather than treat me. And I thought that was a very profound way of putting it. I've noticed something through the years, that there's a certain kind of Christian that specializes in what I call issues that seem very simple that I can be outraged about. The outrage issues. And it seems so clear. Here it is, black and white. An egg and a sperm meet, and at that point, it's a baby. And from there on, we can all feel outraged if anything happens to it. Our mutual friend, Jim Walters, who I did invite, by the way, but I think he has his own class there in the Centennial Complex, and he was probably there today. He wrote a good article that we also printed. It was printed in the San Bernardino paper, and we also printed it on Adventist Today, where he talked about the fact that there. Well, you kind of recapped this there in one of your graphics. That there is a broad range of viability between an egg meeting a sperm and it actually becoming a baby. And
most studies show slightly over 50% of them don't make it all the way.
Right. I think that was part of that piece that he wrote.
Yeah.
In any case, through the years, I have been bedeviled by people who have opinions about things that they can be outraged about.
Sure.
And it's not just abortion, although that's a.
No, we have an outrage economy somehow.
we have an outrage theology, at least.
Yeah.
These are things that I can be very upset about. And there are those that are purely theological, those in the church. When I first started ministry about 50 years ago, you could be very outraged about somebody who came to church wearing jewelry.
Yeah.
It was a major outrage issue. And there were churches, well, certainly eating any unclean food was an outrage issue, going to a movie theater. But now here you have this big, wonderful, broad one. Affects the entire political economy. You can be outraged about abortion. And somehow we have to, I don't know, when I think about back on my pastorate, very seldom did people bring me issues that required a nuanced response.
Yeah.
Most of the issues they came to me with were outrage issues.
Yeah, true. And then, let me just wedge in here as well to some of the earlier comments about the Adventist church and teaching about ethics and how we make this part of our culture. One of the reasons that I went into ethics, I knew I wanted to go for higher education. I was choosing between biblical studies and ethics. What I found out in my local congregation is that we desperately need ethics education in our church because they were eating each other for lunch, for crying out loud. It was terrible.
It's a good point. I took ethics from Jerry Winslow. He was a young professor at Walla Walla at the time.
Me
And
too.
yet, I have to say, very seldom did anyone, this is interesting, very seldom did anyone come to me for ethical guidance. Most of the time, that's not, even if it was something that took a bit of careful, subtle care to take care of, usually that's not how they approached it. People don't walk to the pastor and say, can you give me an ethical reading on this?
Yeah, or often the question to me was, what's God's will about this?
There you go.
Yeah.
That's a very good, but that's an excellent insight. What's God's will on this? Yeah, very good. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to go on for so long.
Well, I think
Carrie Ann, she is.
There we go.
She is Tanisha's sister.
Oh, fun.
Yes, Cherry Ann, I'm more than interested in what you have to say. But I wonder if I can impose on you at this point to give us a short closing blessing, which we like to do as we approach the close of our discussion, if you don't mind.
That is not a problem, Dan.
Go right ahead.
Lord, we thank you, Lord, for the care with which we've been able to approach this difficult topic this afternoon. And we ask that as we close and as we go our separate ways, that the care and the consideration and the concern will continue with us and will continue to be a hallmark of this class and of each of our lives, so that whoever we come in contact with as we go in the week ahead, that they will know that we've had an experience with you and that we are your children. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Cherry Ann.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for the care with which you presented this afternoon. Actually, when I read the summary yesterday, I really didn't want to join because the topic has become so politicized in the US, and I don't have a lot of tolerance for it. I grew up in Jamaica.
So close to the election, I'm exhausted from all of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I grew up in Jamaica. I'm now living in Barbados. And those two countries have very different cultures with regards to abortion. In Jamaica, it's not legal. In Barbados, it is. So I've had experiences with women who have had to have abortions in both countries. And just that legal issue has made such a significant difference in the medical care that these women were able to get. And it really does make me wonder, why it is that we have politicized or we've introduced religion into what I think is, as you've said, it's an ethical issue, but I think it's primarily a medical issue. And I've argued with my OB-GYNs in both countries because I've told them that they seem to care so much more about my ability to be able to have a child than about me and my well-being. I don't have any children, but I've had medical complications that have required me to do a myomectomy and complications from that almost took my life. And as soon as I was healing from that, both of my OB-GYNs said to me, okay, so now that your uterus is healing, you can have a child. And I was like, I'm sorry, I just went through a traumatic experience that almost took my life. Could you give me some time?
Right.
Before we start having that conversation. And I think that is one of the challenges that I find where when you start to consider where is the care for others, the care for the mothers, the love of others that Christ had shown, I find it gets lost in all of these conversations. And I'll share one last thing before you give me your views on that. So I had a colleague in Jamaica who she was looking forward to having her child, had a miscarriage, went to the hospital, she was hemorrhaging, and a nurse kept asking her to admit that, oh, you tried to have an abortion and it didn't go well and that's why you're here. And in order for her to get treatment, I had to call a senior professional that I knew at the hospital to say, I have a friend who is in the accident and emergency unit and she needs help and she's not getting it. Wow. And so when I hear these things, and when I couple all of that with so many doctors who are just, yes, you should have children, you should have children, it makes me wonder, where is the care in all of this conversation?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Two things do come to mind. One is altruism, but the first I'll refer to as the legislative reality. And I think it's easily demonstrated that presently in the states that have restrictive laws about this issue, it is arguably a government of a minority. As far as I know, and again, I'm no sociologist, but as far as I know, the studies in America about those who think abortion should remain a legal option have always outnumbered those who think otherwise. And the pro-life movement has been exceptionally strategically successful in getting legislators elected and in place to change the law. But again, my point is that is the work of a minority governing over a majority. And I think as a democracy, we ought to be pretty darned concerned about that. A couple other things very briefly. A physician who may invoke conscience to recuse him or herself is well established. More recently now, we're starting to see the opposite of that. And what I mean by that is, and there's no terminology really for it because it's new, and that is to argue in the positive. So it's a conscientious assertion. And I recall a physician in Texas after the laws changed there. She went public and said, I will be providing an abortion for my patients. And if you want to sue me, go ahead. The law apparently allows anyone to sue me. And she went public and said, please do that. I feel now that my conscience insists that I offer this service to the public. And I thought that was pretty courageous. And I think we'll start to see more and more people take a position like that. Finally, I'll say that when one offers a service to the public, and I think this is, again, at a public level, a social level, a common good level, when faith-based healthcare wants to remain consistent and tied together with its tradition and yet serve the public, it puts the faith-based healthcare in a necessary moral tension, a space where moral tension is necessary. In other words, it's unavoidable. The public service offered through ministry of a faith tradition has to attend to the public. And in my view, seeking ways to manage that from an individual perspective, writ large at a public perspective, the virtue of altruism compels me personally to set aside my convictions and serve the public's need, this person that is in need in front of me, in ways that might make me uncomfortable, right? But I open my doors to this public to offer this service, so it ought to be uncomfortable to me because the public is messy. And how do we do that at a corporate level for healthcare corporations serving the public under public licensure, wanting to remain deeply connected to the faith tradition? And that just strikes me as extraordinarily difficult. Thanks, Sherry Ann. I think Gina, let's have Gina be our last question. Is that good, Dan?
That's good. I think exactly right. She's my favorite contributor. Go right
no
ahead,
doubt.
Gina.
No doubt.
Go.
Still muted, Gina.
Got it. Thank you. I think the most powerful voice we heard today was that of Tanisha, because she lived it and she has something to say to us. And I think one of the problems that I'm hearing is that we don't have a forum to hear women's voices often enough. The decision makers of hospitals who are deciding ethical considerations about abortion, by and large, don't have women of childbearing years or age on their committee to hear any input. Our churches don't allow women to become ordained. So the voices we hear are men's voices from the pulpit. If we had an army of Tanishas sharing their stories, sharing their experiences, what a different point of view we all would have. It's just shameful, honestly. And you just wonder, there's such a paternalistic or patriarchal need to control people and for men to have the power. I'm just a feminist from a long time ago, and I'm just sickened by how this has gone forward. And the Supreme Court, I hear the rhetoric saying, we wanted to send this back to the states. That's where it should be. It's like, for what? What is the reason for that? And rural America is going to lose their OBGYN community because people who are OBGYNs, they don't want to work in communities where they have to worry about losing their licenses or getting arrested or going to prison. They're just going to bail on people in smaller communities. So there's a lot of, when Lauren was talking about one issue outrage, but no, there's not a lot of consideration of what's coming down the line. What are the unforeseen consequences? A couple of things I'd like to mention. One is I am a lawyer, so I've been in court more often than I've been in an office as a lawyer. I had a litigation courtroom practice. And people who talk about we want an exception for rape or incest, who do you think is going to give exceptions? You're going to go to a judge who's got a very busy calendar, who isn't going to have time to hear your whole story. He's maybe going to have, or she, or maybe going to have time to read a little bit about your situation and then have to make a decision before 5 o'clock. That's, you want to make decisions? I mean, why is that a better idea than a woman who knows her entire history and information, her family situation, to talk with it about her doctor who knows the medical parameters and for them to make the decision? The other thing I want to say is that I've worked in dependency court, which is a court most of you don't know about because it's confidential and spectators are not allowed to participate. It's a court that involves unwanted children, neglected children, abused children. There are so many children in the world who have nobody taking care of them. And for those who are pro-life, they will trot out somebody, and I'm not saying this in a nasty way, although using the word trot was probably not the best. They will bring an example of someone who adopted an unborn child and how wonderful it was. I'm not unborn, a child who was put up for adoption and how wonderful that was. What a wonderful thing that was. For every one of those, I can show you 10 children who were not wanted, who end up in the foster care system, bouncing from house to house to house. I had one little girl who was 13 months old who had been in 9 different homes. You tell me what the outcome is going to be there.
Yeah,
I mean, it's shocking and horrible. And does anybody want to give any money to those born children? Are you kidding me? I mean, so we've got some reality-based issues here. I think we need to have more women at the table talking about the reality of the situation before we make decisions. So that's my feminist piece for you today.
Well, the fun thing is that, Gina, is it okay for me to identify as a feminist? I mean, I found myself teaching feminism in classes for the last 30 years. And part of the reality of my moral distress, and if you don't know that term, I'd urge you to look it up, is that I'm an old white guy making decisions for women in a clinical context. And there's just something patently wrong about that.
Dan and I were watching a show on television that showed the legislature during the Johnson administration, which would have been in the mid-60s. And it was probably 99%, 99.9% white men. White men were making decisions for all of us. It's sickening.
Exactly. Now, I do think, and this goes to an earlier comment, and it'll be my last as well, that there is reason for optimism in both the interest in ethics generally, in the generational, slow-moving, shifting approach toward abortion in our society, and finally, with regard to women involved in ethics and morality. It has arguably been an old, rich, well-educated white guy's world. But in particular, within healthcare, the young physicians and the young people I work with who are interested and involved now in ethics are mostly women. I have a consult team where I practice that is 3/4 or more women. And my sense is that ethics and morality will change. You mentioned paternalism. May have long be dead, but some ethics literature now is talking about maternalism, because some of the ways that we understand maternalism to be more connected, more relational than paternalism. Maybe we'll just go to parentalism, but the point is we can do this better, and women will help us do it better.